All right, guys, so let's go ahead and take a look at the muscles of the head and the face here. So the first muscle we're going to look at is what we call the Sternocleidomastoid, or as we acronym it, the SCM. Now, pay very close attention to the name, because the name is going to tell you what this muscle touches. Sterno, meaning sternum. Clio, referring to the clavicle, and then mastoid, referring to the mastoid process of the skull. So those are our attachment sites. We have the part of the sternum here, we have the clavicle, and we have the mastoid process. Now, one thing to note of this muscle is that there's two bellies to this muscle. There's two parts that make up this muscle. So we have two heads of this muscle, just like we had two heads of the biceps or three heads of the triceps. This sternocleidomastoid has two heads. It has a sternal head and a clavicular head. A sternal head and a clavicular head. Obviously, because we're going to originate on the mastoid process, and we're going to come down to either the sternum, and that'll be the sternal head, or the clavicle, and that would be the clavicular head. Now, important to note of these two heads of the muscle is that the sternal head is more superficial. So the clavicular head is deeper to the sternal head. So let's go ahead and take this little piece of string here and just line this up so we would see what it looks like. So as we would tilt Dex to the side here, we're going to put this right here on the mastoid process, and then we're going to come down to the sternum and the clavicle. So we'll zoom in a little bit so you can see what we're talking about here, and we're going to look at this muscle and its actions, both bilaterally and unilaterally. Plus, we'll also look at the name, particular name it goes by. It also goes by the praying muscle, because this is what bows your head down when you're praying. So if you're praying, much like this muscle bows your head down. So let's look at the bilateral actions. So this is the actions on both sides. So if we attach to the mastoid processes here, and then we attach to the sternum and clavicle here, well, if both sides of this muscle contract, it's going to pull our head forward. So we're going to flex our head and our neck. So it's going to do flexion of the head and neck as a bilateral action. Now, if one side contracted, so we're going to put the string back on here on Dex. If one side contracted, let's pull this string and see what happens. Well, it's going to turn my head. So it's going to rotate my head. So if I tighten this muscle, it's going to rotate my head to the opposite side. So rotation to the opposite side. Now also, while it's pulling, it's going to pull my ear towards my shoulder for lateral flexion. So again, the bilateral actions is just straight flexion of the neck. The unilateral actions are rotation to the opposite side and lateral flexion to the same side. So the next muscles we're going to look at are the Scalenes group. Now, we're not going to get too specific with these muscles and their origin points, but we will get specific with their insertion points. So first thing to note of the Scalenes group is there's three muscles in the group. We have an anterior, we have a middle, and we have a posterior. So these muscles originate from the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae, and then they reach down to attach to the first two ribs. Now, the important thing to note, we're not going to get into which cervical vertebrae they attach to. It's just kind of above and beyond. In your personal practice, you would want to look this up, but just for the MBLEX, it's fine. We don't need to, it's on a non-need to know basis. But I'd say the key thing to note is which of the muscles attach to which ribs. So the anterior and the middle attach to the first rib, and the posterior attaches to the second rib. Again, the anterior and middle scalene attach to the first rib. The posterior attaches to the second rib. So let's take a look at what's going to happen. So again, we notice we have muscles on both sides of the neck or both sides of the spine. So that means we're going to have bilateral and unilateral actions. So let's go ahead and just take a quick look at what the muscle looks like here. So boom, right there, we're going to see that The muscle comes down underneath the clavicle here and attaches to that rib, attaches to the first rib, attaches to the second rib. So let's look at what these actions will perform in a bilateral manner. So if both sides of this muscle contract, well, they're going to flex the head forward, flex the neck, because they don't act on the actual skull itself. They're going to flex the neck forward. So a very similar action to the Sternocleidomastoid. Now, if the neck is in place though, this is another action that we can look at, they'll actually assist in elevation of the ribs for inhalation. Now this is for, really exaggerated breathing. We don't want to use the scalenes for breathing in this manner. That creates what we call paradoxical breathing, which breeds stress and tension in the neck. So we, again, want to breathe diaphragmatically and not use those scalenes or other accessory muscles of respiration. So the scalenes, like we said, bilaterally contracted, flex the neck forward, and then we'll also elevate the ribs. But let's look at them on just one side. So again, we put our string back, and if we were to contract, we would see that this muscle would again pull those vertebrae to that spot. So they're going to do rotation to the opposite side, as well as lateral flexion. So the scalenes pretty much assist the SCM, the Sternocleidomastoid, in all of its actions. So the scalenes, both anterior, middle, and posterior, bilaterally will flex the neck. Unilaterally rotate to the head to the opposite side, and laterally flex the neck to the same side. Now the next muscle we're going to look at is the masseter, the mighty masseter. So for its size, this is the strongest muscle in your body, again, for its size. Now, of course, the larger muscle groups such as the pecs, the pec major, and the gluteus maximus, those muscles are a lot bigger and can produce a heavy amount of output, but relative to its size, your masseter only being this big is extremely strong. You could actually produce enough force to bite down and bite through quite a bit of hard material if your teeth could take it. Your masseter could do the work before your teeth could take it. So let's look at the masseter. Where exactly does the masseter come from? Well, it starts at that zygomatic arch. So it starts right here at this zygomatic arch, and then it comes down and attaches to parts of the mandible here. So it attaches to the ramus and basically comes down to that angle of the mandible itself. So what does the masseter do? Well, the masseter's main responsibility is elevation of the mandible. So we have what we call muscles of mastication. Mastication means to chew. This is masticating your food. This is breaking your food down. So we have muscles of mastication, muscles responsible for chewing your food. And so the masseter is that main muscle for this. It's the one that clenches your jaw up. It's going to elevate your jaw. Now there are two bellies to this muscle, but we're not going to get into that much detail with it. One thing to note though about the masseter is we want to be cautious when working with the masseter because of the parotid duct for our salivary gland, which runs essentially right underneath it, right under our cheekbone here, right under our cheeks, right under that zygomatic arch right there. So one thing to be careful of when working with the masseter in this respect. Now, the next muscle we're looking at is the temporalis muscle. So for the sakes of ease and convenience, we can say that the temporalis muscle, temporalis, temple, comes from that temporal bone. So it originates on the temporal bone, on that nice broad aspect of the temporal bone, and then it comes down through the zygomatic arch and attaches to that coronoid process of the mandible. So it attaches to that coronoid process of the mandible. So we can see that we have this angled movement to this muscle. So first we can see that based off of the orientation, it's going to elevate the mandible. Then it's also going to help to retract the mandible as well. So the temporalis muscle, temporalis, temporal, originates on the temporal bone and then comes down to the coronoid process of the mandible, which produces elevation of the mandible as well as retraction of the mandible itself, or the temporal mandibular joint. Now, the next muscles we're looking at are in groups, and we're not going to break these muscles down by their groups. We're just going to look at them collectively. We're not going to break them down individually, and we're going to be very basic with these. We're looking at the suprahyoids and the infrahyoids. So let's look at the parts of those words. We have supra and infra, and then we have hyoids. So first, let's look at the hyoid, right? As we saw from our lecture on the bones and joints here, that the hyoids, or the hyoid is, I can't get his jaw out the way. The hyoid is this bone that does not articulate with any other bone here in the neck. Now, of course, on Dex, it couldn't just free float, so it has to be anchored to his cervical neck here, but it would be free floating and wouldn't have any support. Its support comes from these muscles, the suprahyoids and the infrahyoids. Now, we looked at one part of that name, one part of that muscle, one part of those muscles, the hyoids. So we know that these muscle groups are attaching to the hyoids. So supra is our word meaning, or deriving from superior, meaning situated above. And then infra is our word for inferior, meaning situated below. So the suprahyoids attach above the hyoid and then insert into the hyoid. And then what they're going to do, well, basically pull them together. So if they're above the hyoid and they come to the hyoid, well, they're going to lift the hyoid up. The infrahyoids originating below the hyoid or inferior to the hyoid, and then coming up to the hyoid, are going to pull the hyoid down. So this helps with swallowing. So these are muscles of what we call deglutition or deglutition. Deglutition, because you're taking a big gulp. Deglutition means to swallow. So these help to move the hyoid up and down, which then helps to propel food and swallow food with it, along with the tongue and everything, of course. But the supra and infrahyoids help to move that hyoid bone up and down in relation to deglutition, so swallowing there. Now, the next muscle we're looking at is the platysma. So this muscle is called the creature of the Black Lagoon muscle because of the old-timey movie that probably many of us haven't seen. But if you actually can look up the creature from the Black Lagoon, you'll see that it has this characteristic, veiny looking neck here. Well, the platysma is this big broad muscle on the front of the neck and basically covers everything. It's like a sheet of muscle over the whole neck complex itself. It comes from the corners of the mouth and then comes down onto basically the upper chest. It crosses over the clavicles, attaches to the chest, and all of that good stuff there. So what is the platysma responsible for? Well, it basically just tightens the neck fascia. Now, the main thing is, we're not going to get caught up with the whole platysma and where it is, where it comes from, where does it go, that whole Cotton Eye Joe thing. We're looking at, or even the actions. We just want to know where that muscle is. So my easiest summation for it is to just say the word and really exaggerate the word. Platysma. So if you see platysma, you can see all of this fascia right here tightening up. So it's pulling the corners of my mouth down. It's tightening up everything here. Just say platysma. Platysma. It's just fun, one. And two, it's actually educational. Now, the next muscle we're looking at is called the occipitofrontalis. Now, this is actually two muscles, but we're going to look at them together. It's actually formed by the frontalis muscle and the occipitalis muscle. So frontalis muscle is the muscle on the frontal bone. The occipitalis muscle is the muscle on the occiput. Now, we're going to look at them together because it's just easier that way. Now, there is one important structure we want to pay attention to when it comes to this muscle. They both parts of the muscle insert on what we call the galea apneurotica. The galea apneurotica, or as we could call it, the epicranial apneurosis. Epicranial apneurosis. That second name makes it a little easier to understand because if we actually break down the parts of that name, epicranial, epi meaning on top of, so this is on top of the cranium, so it's on top of the skull here. Aponeurosis. As we've learned before, an aponeurosis is a thin sheet of connective tissue. So this is a sheet of connective tissue on the top of our skull. So this is, if you look at a poster of the Muscle Man, you'll see white. That's not the top of his skull. The white is not his skull. It's not bone. That's actually connective tissue. So this is connective tissue on the top of our skull. And the muscles themselves are responsible. The frontalis muscle especially does this. It raises your eyebrows. So that is your frontalis muscle. So those are pretty simple. Just remember essentially the Galea aponeurotica or the epicranial aponeurosis. Both names suffice for this structure. Now the next muscles we're looking at are the pterygoid muscles, spelt like a pterodactyl with the P. So the pterygoid muscles, we're not going to look at origins and insertions and this, that, and the other. We have two pterygoid muscles we're looking at. We have a medial and we have a lateral. So when it comes to the two, we just want to see what the biggest difference is. So they're going to have bilateral and unilateral actions, yes, and that's all good and well, but essentially these muscles help to deviate your jaw, so they take the jaw left and right. Now, the difference between the two is that the medial pterygoid actually helps to elevate the jaw as well. So the lateral pterygoid only laterally deviates, get it, lateral to lateral, laterally deviates the pterygoids, or excuse me, laterally deviates the mandible, while the medial pterygoid will laterally deviate the mandible as well as elevate the mandible itself. So not a huge group of muscles we need to care about, but to know is still good. Now, the last few muscles we're going to look at are what we call the muscles of facial expression. Now, there's a lot of muscles of facial expression, but we're just going to look at a few major ones to understand what's going on here. So the first one we're looking at is called the Orbicularis Oculi. Orbicularis. Let's kind of break that down. Orbit, like our planet orbits the sun, it spins in a relatively circular pattern. So Orbicularis Oculi. So Orbicularis, this is a circular ring of muscle, oculi, around the eye. So this circles the eye socket here. And this muscle is responsible for closing your eye and giving that wink like you're going to get an A on this lecture, right? So the Orbicularis Oculi is for the eye socket, the eye. So it's the big muscle over your eye and clenches your eye together in squinting. The next muscle we're looking at is the Orbicularis Oris. So has the same first part of the name as oculi. So that means we're talking about a ring of circular muscle, but Orbicularis Oris. Oris like oral. So this is the circular ring of muscle around your mouth, around your lips, and it helps you to purse your lips, helps you to pucker up. So this is what we call the lover's muscle, because you pucker up for your sweetums. So the Orbicularis Oculi is around the eye, and the Orbicularis Oris is around the mouth. Now be careful with the wording, so really pay attention to and don't get confused and swap them up and overlook the spelling or the word that's listed there. So the next muscle we're looking at is the Zygomaticus muscles. So the Zygomaticus muscles, well, we see a part of that word that we recognize, zygomatic, right? So these muscles come from the zygomatic bone, and then they actually insert onto the corners of the mouth. And we call these muscles the smiling muscles because they help to bring the corners of our mouth up into a smile. So from the zygomatic bone here to the corners of the mouth, they're going to pull it up and give Dex a nice happy smile, right? So the zygomatic muscles, these smiling muscles. Then we're looking at the buccinator. So the buccinator is found in the cheek region, or what we call the buccal region. So the buccinator is in the buccal region. The cheek is known as the buccal. And this helps to just keep the integrity, keeps your chin, or keeps your cheeks tight especially when you're like blowing on a trumpet or a wind instrument. This helps to keep the integrity of your mouth, your cheeks nice and tight when playing a wind instrument. So guys, that's going to do it for all of the muscles today of the head and the face there. So go ahead, take your notes, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a great day. Bye.